Chapter 13. Quite unexpectedly, the events of that stormy night set in motion a great many changes in Ezra's life. He had spent so many years preparing for what he thought was his rightful role as savior. Now, the simple act of accepting that this might not be the case put him on an entirely different path he had never planned to traverse. He felt very lost, and for a week or more he floundered in the ambiguity of his situation, trying to push aside feelings of regret and resentment. He stayed mostly to himself, which he could easily do since Jane and the servants had told him to stay off his injured ankle, and tried to sort through everything that was crowded into his head. The servants were the first to notice that something was different about him. He had never been cruel or unkind to them, but he had always been so intense and so focused on his studies that he had rarely seemed to even notice them. As they attended to him while his ankle healed, however, that began to change. Once or twice in the first few days, he snapped at them, his pride a little hurt by the way they fussed over an injury he considered embarrassingly insignificant. But he seemed to catch himself and apologized sincerely. Then, one day, absent-mindedly, he thanked them for their help. A couple days later, he asked after Flynn's little boy, who had been ill. It was as if there was a little place in his head that was freed up to think about them, where before he had taken them for granted. The servants were quite taken aback. But they quickly grew to like the change. They had always been fond of Prince Ezra, and now were all the more so. Another thing that happened soon after Ezra returned took him completely by surprise. After he had slept a few hours on the day he arrived back home, and was eating supper in his room with his leg propped up on a footstool, Rossley came to see him. Ezra looked up to find that his brother looked both relieved and strangely guilty. "Hello, Rossley," he said as the boy approached his chair. "Hello. It's good to see you're all right," Rossley said, awkwardly but sincerely. "Thank you," Ezra said, perplexed by his attitude. Rossley could tell. He had always been a quietly self-confident boy, but he was fidgeting now. "Ezra, I had to tell them," he blurted out. "I'm sorry." "What's that?" Rossley swallowed. "I had to tell Father about your message. I did not mean to do you wrong. I was sure it was for your own good. But now I have found out that you and Jason would have made it back just fine, even if I hadn't told. If I just kept my mouth shut. Oh, hang it," he finished. He waited miserably for a response. Ezra couldn't believe it. It seemed his own brother was afraid of him. What had he been doing all these years? "Rossley," he said quickly, "don't worry about it. I am glad you told Father." Rossley looked up and stared at him. "You're glad?" "Very. Father needed to know. Besides, any number of things could have happened to us on the way to the hamlet if we hadn't had the warriors with us there at the end, even once we found the horses. No jest, I really am thankful to you. You have a good head on your shoulders and did the smart thing. And I shouldn't have asked you to take that message in the first place, or sworn you to secrecy, or offered you money to keep quiet. I know that was low of me. I am sorry." Rossley stared, tongue-tied, a little bit longer. "I don't mind. It's all right," he managed. They shook hands heartily. Ezra, trying to think of how he could begin to bolster this obviously lacking relationship, invited Rossley to pull up a chair. Rossley grinned and sat down. The conversation began awkwardly, and they searched for things to say. But slowly, they began to talk with one another in a way they never had before. Ezra had always thought of Rossley as a strange child, and had often been uncomfortable when his eyes met the thoughtful, penetrating gaze of his brother. Especially of late, the Crown Prince had spent little time with his siblings, and now he could hardly even believe how pleasantly the evening passed, as he frankly told Rossley the details of what had happened between him and Jason. Rossley listened without judgment. After that, when Ezra asked him what kinds of things he found himself doing lately, he told him about his archery practice and hunting with his hawk. Rocky, inseparable from his master, lay on the floor between them, and got up occasionally to put his huge head in Rossley's lap. Ezra ventured to pet the noble beast, something he realized he had barely ever done before. Through the days that followed, even as Ezra mostly isolated himself, trying to deal with the strangeness of his situation, Rossley was always nearby, and turned out to be just the right sort of person to have around. Jason also sought him out several times. He was determined not to lose the progress he had made with the prince, and he also had a lot of questions. For, now that everything was out in the open, he recognized the value of Ezra's well-honed knowledge and skills, and decided he should try to learn from him. Meanwhile, at the urging of King Terran, the date for the ceremony was rescheduled for 2 weeks after the original date. Only a few of the Ingers knew all the details of why Jason and Ezra had gone missing, but it was generally known that the two boys had quarreled, and that everything had been made right. Though some people looked upon this news grimly, After the initial chaos died down, the majority of the tribe accepted it, for their king showed no change in his attitude towards the alliance. Jason was still honorable and kind, and Prince Ezra seemed to be the better for the quarrel. There is no doubt, however, that the first few days after the conflict were filled with uncertainty and proved very stressful for everyone involved. But one day, a few days before the ceremony, something happened that helped smooth over the situation and restore people's trust in Jane and Jason. Late in the afternoon, Jane, Margaret, Jason, and Jerem were strolling through the woods on the eastern side of the hamlet, not far from the gate. They were taking a break from the bustle in the hamlet, discussing the ceremony and how they could address people's concerns regarding Jason's disappearance. Just as they were turning back towards home, they saw an odd-looking object lying in the leaves a few yards away from the path. They moved closer to view it, cautiously, especially when they recognized it was a creature. Suddenly, Jerem seemed to identify it. He got closer, bent down, and peered at it. "Aha! Just what I thought. A toothed raptor," he said, perplexed. "What's wrong with him?" Margaret asked. "He's wounded," Jane said, kneeling beside the creature. He was about the size of an eagle, with short brown fur, not feathers, and a light, slender frame. Wing flaps stretched between his arms and legs, like a flying squirrel's. Jason asked if they were for gliding, and Jerem explained that they could fly just like birds. He had a foot-long, tapering beak, lined with sharp teeth, and a short, slender tail that ended in a tassel-like clump of hair. Jane was right. He had an ugly wound in his shoulder, just above where his wing began, and seemed to be unconscious. "Arrow wound," Jerem observed. "Somebody has already tried to tend to this," Jane said, examining the injury. "It's been partly cleaned up, but whoever it was didn't know how to properly care for it." She looked up. "If I can get to my book and my medical supplies, I can take care of this. He's weak from blood loss, but I think he'll be all right. It doesn't seem to be a critical wound. Should we carry him back to the royal house?" Jerem nodded. "That's a good idea. The toothed raptors have always been good creatures, and I hate to see one suffer." Jane pulled off her cloak and laid it down on the ground beside the creature. Jason and Jerem stooped to lift him so she could slide the cloak underneath. But before they touched him, a loud croak came from the tree behind them, and another toothed raptor swept to the ground beside the wounded one. This one was a little smaller, and its fur was a shade lighter. "A female," Jerem told Jason in a low voice. "Don't scare her." "Hello," Jason began, but she shrank away from him and moved closer to the wounded raptor. "Stay back from my husband," she snapped desperately, sheltering him with her wing. "He is helpless and at thy mercy. If thou shouldst dare to harm him in such a condition, it would be the greatest cowardice." Hey, calm down. It's okay," Jane urged. "Look, we're only trying to help him. He won't be able to fly if this wound isn't properly tended, especially if it gets infected." The toothed raptor hesitated. I know," she said softly. Jerem knelt down beside her. "I'm a hooky, ma'am. You know that our tribe has always had a good relationship with the toothed raptors." "'Tis true," she agreed. "But what brings thee to the Inger village?" Jerem nodded towards Jane and Jason. "Them. They passed the tower test and have come to liberate Griffyngrein. They're here with the Ingers to form an alliance. The Hookies have already committed, and the Ingers will this week." The toothed raptor looked slowly from Jerem to Jane and Jason, and back again. "Can this be true?" she wondered to herself. Jason drew his sword from underneath his cloak and showed it to her. She gasped. "The sword of the kingdom! It is thee who opened the stone chest!" she exclaimed. "Yes. How do you know about the chest?" Jason asked in surprise. "We toothed raptors are the only sentient creatures in Griffyngrein with flight, save griffins themselves. Only we have been able to behold the tower from above, in the years since it was first sealed. Often I have seen that chest, and often have I longed to feast my eyes on the treasures it held. 10 nights ago, as we flew over, we saw the chest lying open and empty in the moonlight, and we dared to hope the Savior had come." "That was our doing," Jason said. "There was a book of healing in that chest, too," Jane said, "and I know how to use it. Will you please let us take your husband back to the hamlet and tend to him? As soon as he is cared for, we'll let him go, I promise. You can come too, of course, and stay with him the whole time. You just need to trust us. He needs our help." The creature looked searchingly at Jane for a long moment. Then she drew a long breath. "Yes, please take him." She bowed. "My name is Gladlam. My husband is Rantham." "What happened to him?" Jason said. "He was shot by a Terfung," Gladlam said with angry tears. "One of their patrols happened to spot him as he flew overhead, not far away from here, outside the wall. The vile brutes despise our species most of all because they cannot contain us, and I suppose one of them decided to use him as target practice. He fell here. I got the arrow out, but the wound is more than I can manage." "He'll recover," Jane reassured her, sternly assuring herself that she knew enough to make such a promise. "He will be awfully sore for a while, though. I wouldn't plan on flying anywhere soon." Gladlam, though relieved, still looked troubled. "I feared as much." She hesitated, and then said in a whisper, "We have a nest outside yonder wall. I must return to it now. I have already been gone too long. But I depended on Rantham for food and for protection while I tended the eggs. What shall I do now?" Jason frowned in thought. How many eggs are there?" "3. "Well, would you mind if we carried them?" "Carried them?" "Yes, if you took us to the nest, we could carry them into the hamlet with Rantham. You would all be safe here." Margaret quickly agreed. "Gladlam, as Princess of the Ingers, I can assure you that you are most welcome here." Hope sprang into Gladlam's eyes. "How can I thank thee enough? Yes, come with me. I shall show you to the eggs." Jane and Margaret carried Rantham back to the hamlet in Jane's makeshift stretcher, while Jason, Jerem, and Gladlam ventured cautiously out into the woods. There they encountered a lone Terrifung, very likely the one who had shot Rantham, curious to find whether he had downed his target. He saw Jason and Jerem just as they saw him, and attacked them. Jason, despite his utter lack of training, brandished his sword and helped Jerem, however clumsily, to take the Terrifung down. Then, hiding the body, they hurried to finish their mission before they ran into more trouble. The nest, which was a sturdy, intricately woven piece of work created lovingly by Gladlam and Rantham, was transferred from its original home in the forest to the welcoming arms of a great tree that stood in the lawn of the royal house. The eggs, which had been wrapped carefully in Jason's cloak for the journey to the hamlet, were soon under Gladlam's tender care again. Jane cared for Rantham well, and he was soon conscious again. His initial bewilderment at finding himself in the neat, quiet sick room of the royal Inger house was quickly replaced by deep gratitude, for she had cleaned, anointed, and bandaged his wound, and was able to confidently assure him that he was well on his way to recovery. News of this incident spread through the hamlet, and public opinion of Jason and Jane began to improve. The day of the ceremony came. The banquet hall flooded with people, and the entire event proceeded flawlessly. Prince Ezra, his ankle much improved, stood in the front row of the crowd of Ingers as they rose to salute their new leaders, presented to them by King Terran. He bowed with the rest of them, and as he rose again, he looked Jason and Jane straight in the eyes and smiled. Just before the Ingers could raise a cheer, there was a loud whirring of wings from outside the open door of the banquet hall. The next moment, a great multitude of toothed raptors filled the rafters. Rantham leaped from his chair nearby and stood at Jane and Jason's feet. Other toothed raptors flocked behind him, and Gladlam came to his side. "My lord and my lady," Rantham said, "thy kindness towards my family has not been forgotten. Little didst thou realize that the chief of the toothed raptors was in thy care. I now present myself and my entire tribe to thy cause. We are thy servants." As one, the toothed raptors cried out, "Hail, Commander Fields! Hail, Lady Kents!" The Ingers joined in, and the banquet hall swelled with voices of allegiance. Chapter 14. 2 months later. 5 ships still labored on through murky, treacherous waters, as steadily as they had on the week they set sail. But much had changed. The ships were battered, as if they had encountered much more than perilous waves. Sails were torn. Some of the landing boats were missing. Aboard the Trinity, Admiral Gibbs stepped out of his cabin. He looked haggard, and his arm was in a sling. His sister came to meet him across the swaying deck. Her face, too, was pinched and tired. But, like her brother, she still held her head up, and quiet determination lingered in her eyes. An evil fog had surrounded the ship. It was not thoroughly blinding, but it threatened to disguise all objects and confuse the exhausted sailors watching from the crow's nests and the weathered decks. As Carrie reached Admiral Gibbs, she felt a cold, strange wind begin to blow around her, foreign to the sea breezes to which she was accustomed. She hesitated, and turned slowly around to look past the prow, into the fog. Her brother moved out of the doorway of the cabin, his eyes also fixed ahead, and put his hand on her shoulder. For a long moment they stared ahead, listening to this whistling, haunting wind. Carrie looked up into his face, pale. "Brian?" He nodded. "It is time," he said hoarsely. Scarcely 5 minutes later, the sailor in the crow's nest cried out, "Captain, I see it!" And there was terror in his voice. Captain Larkpin silently joined Carrie and the Admiral, and the three of them watched a huge, all-encompassing black mass take shape in the mist before them. The winds grew wilder and whirled in all different directions. Sharp rocks pierced the waves on either side of the ships, which now fell into single file behind their command vessel. Finally, the fog was whipped away to reveal the Black Pass. A great barrier of black rock surrounded them on three sides, massed together in great, cruel, bare cliffs and foam-smattered boulders. Directly ahead, down a watery avenue lined with rock teeth, was a massive, yawning mouth into the pass. It was completely dark within, and it was from this mouth that the evil, cold winds were blowing. Admiral Gibbs and his crew did not once consider turning back. Throughout their journey they had known that this was coming, and that it was unavoidable if they were truly dedicated to the mission that had caused them all to leave their own war-torn land and their families. The Admiral ordered the men to the oars, and they slowly moved forward to the mouth of the pass. But when the ship's bow thrust into the thick darkness, veiling the entrance, they made a dreadful discovery. The massive, salty tunnel split into two directions, one veering slightly off to the right, the other to the left. The legends about the Black Pass had always been as murky in detail as they were haunting. The only people who had ever seen it were the few survivors of ships that had turned back in terror before entering the pass. With the seafarers' natural propensity for elaborating, altering, and fabricating the details of their adventures, combined with their harrowing experiences in the wild waters, these worn, haggard sailors told intensely bizarre stories about the nature of the Black Pass, none of which lined up with another. Now, as Admiral Gibbs and his men stared into this gluttonous mouth, they knew the truth. It was just as fearsome as the legends, but for a very real reason. The Black Pass was an ocean labyrinth. There was now a great dilemma. Some of the sailors said that since both of the paths only veered away slightly, they would be equally likely to lead to the other side. Others protested that no one could tell how severely the tunnels would veer off deeper in the pass. Certainly, no one knew how far it was to the other side. Any number of twists and turns could occur within. Still others claimed that they smelled a foul, ominous scent blowing from one of the tunnels that strongly hinted there were beasts lurking inside. Many of them pointed out that the right-hand tunnel was narrower than the left, and its sides were quite jagged in some places. Admiral Gibbs called for a sounding. The water was just deep enough to carry the ship safely. He wondered if there was a chance of running aground inside the pass, and if one tunnel was deeper than another. The only comfort was that there was no current driving the ship in either direction. They could make their choice deliberately and carry it out with caution. All the same, it was an agonizingly difficult decision that the Admiral now faced. The tunnels were too narrow for them to possibly turn around once they entered. Once they made a choice, they were committed, regardless of what came next. The whole fleet dropped anchor, and he signaled the 4 other captains to meet with him on the Trinity, where she waited, quivering in the swirling, splashing foam, with her prow peering into the darkness. Night fell as the captains and their admiral stood huddled in their coats on the deck, gazing at the pass and discussing their options. With the nightfall came rain, a steady, driving rain and a hint of thunder in the distance. The crew was cold, wet, and full of doubt as they waited for orders. They had been deliberating for a long while when the sailor in the Trinity's crow's nest spotted a warm, rich light coming from far down the tunnel to the left. He called out to his shipmates, and soon they were gathered on the main deck, watching the light grow brighter and nearer. The admiral and the captains halted their conversation and watched also, perplexed, wondering what could possibly be approaching them. Finally, the source of the light swung into view around a corner in the tunnel. A ship. It was a portly, brightly lit, friendly-looking merchant vessel, and as it drew closer, the men on the Trinity could hear the merry, robust voices of the rowers singing together. So cheerful and careless did it seem, sailing from the very heart of this dreadful place, that the crews of the 5 vessels were thoroughly astonished and felt their hearts lifting. It was indeed a welcome sight. "Ahoy!" called a strong, deep voice from the new vessel when it neared the Trinity. "What brave vessels now knock at the door of the Black Pass?" Captain Niles, who commanded one of the supply vessels, smirked. "It's our knees that are knocking," he murmured. Now that the vessel was near enough, they could see in the glow of its swinging lanterns that its figurehead was unusually shaped. It was a huge gilt scroll, on top of which was fixed a platform with an elaborately fashioned railing. On this platform, balancing effortlessly with the swaying of the ship, stood a tall, broad, muscular man with a long, flowing cape of a burnt orange color. It was he who had called out to them. As the prow came within a few feet of the Trinity's ramming bow, they could see the name of the ship, the Counselor. They could also see the face of the man who stood on the platform. He had the refined features of a nobleman, a short black beard, and straight black hair that fell halfway down his neck. His clothes, which were black under the orange cape, were simple seafarer's garments. Overall, he was an impressive figure, and his smile was warm and friendly as he saluted the crew of the Trinity. Admiral Gibbs, flanked by Carey and Captain Larkman, hastened to the prow to speak with him. "I am Admiral Brian Gibbs," he said, "and our fleet is determined to pass through this dark place. But we are delayed with doubts, for we know not which of these two routes to take." "Admiral Gibbs," the man answered, saluting again. "I, Captain Monchi of the Counselor, rejoice that fate led me to return to this side of the pass today." "You have been all the way through?" the Admiral asked in amazement. Captain Monchi smiled. "I have, many a time now. And as for your doubts, Admiral, doubt no more. I have led many ships safely through the pass, and will gladly do so again, for you, on this stormy night." The Admiral, hardly believing such good fortune, looked at Carey and Captain Larkman. The latter tapped him on the shoulder. "There has to be a catch, sir," he said in a low voice. "He must want something in return." Admiral Gibbs nodded. "Of course." Raising his voice, he asked, "That is indeed a generous offer. At what price do you perform such a service?" Captain Monchi threw back his head and laughed heartily. "Ah, so often I seem to encounter this cynicism of late. 'Tis a sad thing, really. I require nothing from you, Admiral Gibbs. Guiding yet another ship safely through the Black Pass is payment enough." "Is it a dangerous journey?" the Admiral asked. "It depends. If you go to the left and follow my lead, you will find the journey almost pleasant, it is so simple, despite the darkness of the pass. But if you go to the right, I cannot begin to tell you all the peril you will find there. Countless times have I arrived too late to see pieces of vessels and lifeless carcasses floating out of that tunnel." "How did you find the way?" Captain Larkman spoke up. "Who guided you?" Captain Monchi looked at him. "Fate. A smiling fate was my only guide. Now I can share her gift to me with others." They were all silent for a moment, as Admiral Gibbs thought. "Oh, I nearly forgot. Admiral Gibbs, pray tell me one thing," Captain Monchi said. "What is that, Captain?" "You wouldn't happen to have had any dealings with pirates, would you? There is a particular handful of rogues that I would very much like to find." Admiral Gibbs frowned. "Yes, unfortunately we have. And I must confess it was one of the strangest experiences I have ever had as a seaman." Captain Monchi raised his brows. "Oh? What happened?" "They invaded us from under our ship, in a sort of underwater carriage. There were only 3 of them, but they put up a fierce fight." The captain looked concerned. "How odd. Did any of you come to harm?" "We lost 2 men, and several more were wounded. He used a sort of sleeping potion against my crew right before he was caught, but those victims recovered. We caught them right as they were entering the ship, and were able to suppress them fairly quickly. They are our prisoners even now." 3 underwater invaders, Captain Monchi mused. "No, those aren't the pirates I was looking for. But I am glad you told me about them, for that is a threat to watch for." "Indeed it is," Admiral Gibbs said. "I have had watchmen posted on the lower levels of all our ships ever since." "A wise move, Admiral. I must follow suit. But now, will you allow me to guide you through the pass?" The Admiral looked at Captain Larkman. "What think you, Captain?" "I think it might be the best choice, sir," Captain Larkman said slowly. Admiral Gibbs turned to his sister. "And what about you, Carey?" Carey looked at him, deep in thought. Then, quietly, she turned and walked away. Captain Larkman, taken aback, started to call her, but the Admiral stayed him quickly. All eyes turned to the girl as she walked towards the Admiral's cabin. Reaching it, she unlatched the door and stepped inside. The door swung almost closed behind her. A moment later, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor reached their ears. The sailors looked at each other in confusion. What could she possibly be doing? She threw open the door and stepped out, drawing after her the large sea chest that had been sitting against the wall. Leaving it just inside the door, she knelt down and threw open the lid. Immediately, a bright blue light flooded out in all directions, but only momentarily. Hardly a second had passed before the light started to change its course. The expansive glow began to narrow more and more until it had focused itself into a brilliant, penetrating beam. And slowly this beam turned itself, radiating past the mesmerized faces on the Trinity, past Captain Monchi, who shielded his face with the hood of his cloak, and past the lanterns of the counselor, which now looked no longer golden, but dull and sickly. Finally it came to a halt, shining directly and unwaveringly down the tunnel to the right, as far as the eye could see. Carrie walked back to join her brother. Admiral Gibbs stared at the beam for several minutes. He became aware of the whispering amongst his men. He also became painfully aware of Captain Monchi's eyes under the orange hood, glowing strangely as they reflected the blue beam, fixed upon him. He turned to meet the captain's gaze. The captain gave a concerned smile. "Admiral," he said, "surely you're not considering following this light straight into the dangers of that horrible tunnel? Why, that sort of folly seems quite beneath you. I am certain you are wise enough to know that the counsel of a man who has been through the Black Pass many times will be more reliable than this meaningless beam. Think of it. It is light, nothing more." Carrie put her hand on the Admiral's arm. "Brian," she said, quietly but urgently, "there is one reason, and one reason only, that we left our homeland." She pointed at the chest meaningfully. "We all know that. How could we desert its guidance now and expect to reach our goal?" Brian nodded. "I know, Carrie. I know." He looked over the deck at the faces of his men, who were all gathered there, watching him, looking at the beam, and sizing up the other captain in his ship. Brave, faithful, sturdy men they were, devoted to their mission. Brian knew with a sinking feeling in his stomach that the decision he was about to make could end each of those noble lives. They would vanish forever in that dark place, and word of their fate would never even reach home. He looked down at the small, upturned face of the little sister he had always fiercely protected, doing his best to keep her safe even in all those years of danger and war back home. But he knew those eyes. They were the eyes of his father, filled with stubborn bravery. If he tried to turn back now or avoid necessary danger for her sake, she would, perhaps, never forgive him. He knew she was right. They had a mission, and had already paid dearly for it, because they knew how important it was. This was no time to change course. Resolved, he turned to look Captain Monchi in the face, and unknowingly looked exactly like his father himself. "Captain," he said, "your words are indeed persuasive, and no doubt you speak with impeccable logic. But perhaps, sometimes, it is better to follow a light than a man. For one clearly illuminates the way, even if that way is perilous. The other can only promise guidance through the darkness." "But, Admiral," Captain Monchi protested. "We must be gone. Every minute is precious," Admiral Gibbs said firmly. "I tell you, you must not do this," Captain Monchi spat. "It is utter madness." The Admiral turned away. "Farewell, sir. Thank you for offering your services. May your benevolent fate never frown upon you." Without needing a word from Admiral Gibbs, Captain Larkpin turned to the crew and called out orders. In a moment, the Trinity's prow was lined up with that steady blue beam. In another moment, she was moving slowly, bravely towards the tunnel, leaving the counselor and its furious captain behind. "You are a fool, Admiral Gibbs," Captain Monchi bellowed after him. "Tomorrow morning, it shall be your carcasses and the bones of your precious ship that will be hurled from the jaws of the Black Pass." No one looked back. In the prow of the Trinity, Admiral Gibbs stood with his arm around his sister, who with both hands was holding high a brilliant orb, from which streamed the guiding beam. One by one, the ships of that brave fleet vanished into the Black Pass. Long after they had all disappeared, the tunnel still glowed with a faint blue light. And that's the end of Section 2.